Welcome to Statistically Speaking, a CK Pharma Solutions podcast where Kay
and Caroline.
In each episode, we bring you conversations with industry leaders from pharma, biotech, and CROs.
Together, we explore market insights, career advice, and the latest trends shaping the life sciences industry. Get ready for discussions that inspire, inform, and help you navigate the ever-evolving world of life sciences. This is Statistically Speaking, navigating the world of life sciences.
So today's guest has built and led a clinical operations team at some of the most innovative biotech companies and now advises early stage startups. Suzanne Vyvoda brings years of experience, sharp insights, and a clear perspective of what it takes to run trials that work. We're excited to have her on and talk about her career journey and what she's learned along the way. Suzanne, welcome to Statistically Speaking. How are you doing?
Fine, thanks. And thanks so much for having me on. I think you guys have built a really cool audience and this is a great platform. So I'm really excited to chat with you guys today. Thanks so much.
Perfect. Well, look, we're so happy that you're on. And I think what we like to do when we have guests on is start from the very top because everyone wants to know everything. So with that being said, let's start at the beginning. What first pulled you into clinical research space, specifically into clinical operations?
Great question. And to be honest with you, I mean, picture someone kind of randomly falling out of the door that is the exit of college and landing into the right spot. It was completely happenstance. I left college with really no idea what I wanted to do or where it would take me. And I happened to live close to a large medical center that served, a whole bunch of neighboring states and therefore had a wide variety of physicians and a lot of clinical trial activity. Because if you're serving a large community, of course, you're serving, a number of different indications, et cetera. And I worked for a physician up there who was very heavily involved in clinical research. And he had moved from another institution, walked into my office one day and said, here are some protocols, please open them. And I didn't know what a protocol was and I didn't know what open even meant. It was completely foreign language to me. But, I was within a really structured university system. Of course, there was an IRB. Of course, there were classes and courses and certifications you had to take in order to interact with it. But, think of an onion when you start to peel back the layers. And, through that site lens, I really got to discover what drug development looks like through the PI lens, through the physician lens, and through the patient lens. At first, I was very back end of the office, doing a lot of site-based regulatory filings, interacting with monitors and sponsors. But that shifted and to be a really patient-facing sort of standard CRC role, where I really got to understand, number one, what that patient experience looks like. And this was oncology. So these are incredibly tough diagnoses. They're very impactful on families, on individuals. They just upend lives. And so seeing, what drug development was really trying to do to really improve these patients' experiences, improve their lives, improve their outcomes was really, really just so almost magical to me. And I realized again, as I continued to kind of peel back the layers of that onion, that there was this whole world out there that, that was drug development. There were CROs, there's industry sponsors, there were NCI sponsored trials, there were investigator initiated trials. There are a whole bunch of different ways that clinical trials are taking place. And I also kind of had, trial by fire, like right out of the water hose. I learned that I needed to learn how to draw patients' blood. I learned that I'd need to learn how to use a central EKG machine that was sent to me in the mail with an instruction manual. I learned that I'd have to learn how to use a centrifuge to spin and process blood and ship it out. And I just remember kind of running all over the hospital figuring it out. But I liked that aspect of putting the puzzle together in order to benefit the patient. And getting to learn things from the site side first gave me that sort of boots on the ground foundation for how clinical trials work, what works well. And again, this is close to 20 years ago, maybe what doesn't work so well. So what I found at the site was it seemed like the protocols were being written without any idea what someone like me as a coordinator was responsible for, or what my workflow was like, or what I did versus what I was reliant on the PI, infusion nurses, other nurses, phlebotomists, folks in imaging, it was clear that it was really not written with that kind of viewpoint in mind. And so I got really passionate about thinking, as I grow my career, I want to sit at the table where they write the protocol, because it needs a broader span of voices, because the amount of deviations that come up because protocol procedures simply aren't accomplishable the way that they're written is a reality. And I think it's a reality that's probably improved over time. We're not using fax machines for IXRS. We're not using data capture in triplicate paper forms. There's so many things that we're doing much better, much more efficiently now. However, looking back on it, there are still a lot of ways that we can improve. So the foundation of my career was that site side, and then wanting to understand how the rest of the industry really worked.
So you really went and started from like the bottom of the, not the bottom of the ladder, but started from the ladder, you worked your way up to where you are right now and did every single thing, and then realized like, okay, I like this. I'm seeing some gaps. I want to fix this. I want to see at the table what I can eventually be able to fix everything that I'm seeing that's not really working. And I know ways that can be done better. That makes sense?
Yes, I think that's fair. And to be, there are brilliant physicians and scientists and executives that form these companies that come up with these treatments. But I love the idea of operationalizing clinical trials. Like, what do you do with a concept that sounds scientifically, that sounds medically, but ultimately that trial has to be implemented somewhere between a CRO, vendors, sites. It ultimately has to be attractive to patients, accessible to patients. And we have so many different critical stakeholders across this industry. The further and further I got, which was a journey that I had to kind of figure out myself, there was no roadmap for the journey that I ended up taking, which is part, again, of that fragmentation we see between those different stakeholders. There is no, oh, cool, you're a CRC. Here are some different directions you can take to grow within the industry. Now, there are a lot more resources now than there were. And honestly, this is way pre-LinkedIn, and this is pre-social media. There were no places to tap into, others that had kind of paved that way before. And I remember being told, as a coordinator, you're not going to work at a CRO. As a coordinator or as a CRA at a CRO, you're not going to work at a sponsor. You've got to stay in your zone. And I decided that was something I was kind of hell-bent on proving wrong.
Yeah. And I think when I first came across your profile, I think one of the things that I was so interested in is that you've worked in small biotechs, you've worked in larger biotechs. And I think each, especially when it's smaller versus larger, they shape you very differently. So how did a small biotech versus a larger biotech shape your leadership style?
Sure. So I think the biggest thing in a larger company is there's a lot of infrastructure. There are leaders you can ask. There are people who have been there longer than you. There are SOPs. There are processes. There are really well-established functions. There's a regulatory group. There's a data management. There's a stats group. There's a medical group, and you're surrounded by people who you can ask. And that's often really, really helpful on the sponsor end when you're starting out, or when you're sort of getting to that leadership stage, but you haven't necessarily paved that way yourself. But the reality is, in a startup, and people either love this or they get really uncomfortable, is there's none of that infrastructure unless you create it. So you're starting from the ground up. You have to know how things should work, and then design processes to fit for purpose, right? What is the therapy area? What is the phase of trial? What kinds of vendor relationships and partnerships are we going to need? How many sites do we need? Is this US? Is this global? You were then left to really pave the way yourself. And there's a phrase we hear a lot in startups, and building the plane while flying it. And you have to balance that energy, that excitement about a new technology and new medication with really thinking through upfront what your operational plan is and how you plan to really execute against that trial. Because it's great, we want that FPI. We want to hit first patient in on that first trial. That's exciting at a startup. but you also need to get to last patient out. That's ultimately what's most important, where folks like you guys come in. The data is ultimately the most important thing we're going to get out of that trial. So what data do we need? What patients do we need to get that data? And where are we going to find those patients? Unfortunately, clinical trials still are incredibly difficult for patients to navigate. Clinicaltrials.gov is not a great resource for patients. It's not really designed that way. And unless you're really plugged into a strong social work or a patient advocacy network, Googling trials, the specificity that, of course, we know that protocols come with is not patient friendly, number one. And number two, the trials are open where they're open. So finding something that's applicable to you as a patient can be nearly impossible. And I think that's something our industry really needs to address on a more baseline level.
Yeah. I spoke to a head of biostatistics recently, and he kind of had a very similar career, small biotech, big pharma. And the way he explained it to me is like, when you go to a small biotech, you have to really build the puzzle. You are the person building the puzzle. When you go to a pharma, the puzzle's already built. It's like, how are you going to fit? Are you going to fit in that? Or if you are, great, we'll have you. If you're not, then we'll move on. Like this is fine. So the way he explained this to me was so interesting. It's like, that's why he's like, for me, when I was in my early stage, I want to be in a big pharma because that's how I develop. And then that's how I can be part of projects that probably I wouldn't be able to do in the small biotech. But the small biotech is where I want to be after I've learned so much and I can bring it to it and help them grow.
I love the imagery of the puzzle. I use that myself pretty frequently because number one, I love the idea of putting puzzles together, whether it be a jigsaw puzzle on my floor or a clinical trial puzzle that needs to be executed. And I think that's really well stated. I agree with that. I think if you go into small biotech, depending on what level you are, as a leader, you have to be prepared to lay the groundwork, to lay the infrastructure, to choose the right vendors, to build the right relationships, and to build a team that is going to thrive in that kind of environment. It's definitely not for everyone. The reality is that big pharma is a great place to learn. And some people do their best work in a really structured environment. And each company is a little bit different, but you're sort of surrounded by other people doing similar things within the same infrastructure. And when you're in a startup, you're on your own. So it's your knowledge of how the system works, what the regulations are, and, really partnering cross-functionally with the other folks that are there. I'll also take it a step further, but I think that really building strong vendor partnerships is important. That's your CRO, that's your specialty vendors, those are your sites. Sites don't know small sponsors. There's a gazillion small sponsors. And so forming direct relationships with sites is important. But your CRO ultimately takes on so much from you in a small biotech because you really need to fully outsource your trial. And, there's a push and pull there. But I find that the more of a relationship you establish upfront with the CRO or other vendors, where it's not kind of vendor against sponsor, there can be so much friction. There can be so much lack of alignment when we see these relationships develop and we don't have that strong foundation. We're not aligned on, say, timelines or deliverables from the beginning. It's sort of that ethos of walking before you can run and really thinking about, what the right path forward is for that particular program and that particular company. I don't believe in only using big CROs or only using small CROs. I don't think that there's a perfect CRO and there's certainly not a perfect sponsor. I'll be the first to admit that. But I think really leaning into who those partnerships are with and them being fit for purpose.
Now, Suzanne, you eventually stepped into executive and fractional roles. What made you decide to take that path, and how's that different from being a full-time at one company?
Great question. So I think over time, clinical operations is always going to be my heart and soul. And I think it's really a critical, often underestimated portion of any biotech company. When you have a clinical stage asset, clinical operations is the beating heart that's going to make that trial a reality. But I quickly discovered, especially working in startups, that there was joy in wearing multiple hats, in learning what else was going on outside of clinical operations that really made the company what the company was. There's CMC, there's quality, there's regulatory, there's finance, there's legal. There are so many other pieces that have to happen to make a company come together. And I, especially again, in smaller companies with a larger title and larger influence, became fascinated with learning more than just clinical operations. I think clinical operations is something I will always be passionate about, but I've loved expanding my knowledge set so that I can support companies more broadly. And ultimately, what happened in my particular situation was an exit at the end of 2023. The company that I was working for, leading development operations, was acquired by a large pharma company. These are things we celebrate in biotech, but obviously the past couple of years have been really, really volatile in our industry. We see a lot of reductions in force. We see programs being canceled. We see funding is really, really difficult to get. The benchmarks are different. They're higher than they used to be. And we now have found ourselves in an environment where we have so many people that are unemployed and looking for work in our industry. Whereas you would have had a couple of applicants for a role before you have hundreds, if not thousands. People are getting roles through their network. And so we're having to get more creative as an industry about how to position ourselves, how to find work, how to network, and how to continue to move our careers forward. And one way that I have seen effective, and I know many other people across different disciplines that do this as well, is through being fractional. And what that means is, think of a small company, a company that likely doesn't have a lot of funding. The minute you bring on an executive team to manage all of the different functions, that is a significant financial lift. Maybe you don't need a full-time CFO, but you need someone at that level to help you manage your finances. Maybe you don't need a full-time chief medical officer, but you need a physician who can weigh in on what your clinical programs are going to look like and what you need to do in advance of those. So what fractional really looks like is, imagine that you're embedded within the company. You're an employee, but you work there 25% of the time or 50% of the time. And so that company is benefiting from having senior level experts help them move their programs forward, whether they be clinical or otherwise. And then as a leader, you can help multiple companies. So maybe I'm helping a couple of different companies with different programs. Maybe I'm advising some companies that are a little bit outside of the space, CROs or tech companies or SMOs or folks that interact in the biotech ecosystem. And so it allows you to diversify your career. But back to the biotech company, sometimes the answer isn't to hire someone more junior. It's to look for more creative ways to engage executive level talent. And fractional work has been, I think, something we've seen a lot more of, not just in biotech, but across other industries, as a way to lean into getting that executive level talent without having to bring on that FTE with a very high salary, with benefits, with it's a much higher price tag where you have very limited resources.
Yeah. And I think that's something that we do. And, there's different names for it, but advisory roles. So it's kind of speaking to people like yourself who have been in the industry for such a long time and have so much knowledge and experience, where it's okay, there's a small biotech. They don't want someone full time. They want someone who's a head of biometrics, head of biostats, head of clinops. You're going to come in, you're going to work maybe 4 hours a day, 5 hours. It just depends, maybe 3 hours a week, whatever they need. And you're basically going to advise them, and it saves them the money of having to, like you said, bring on someone that's full time, because biotechs right now just seem to have not enough money to be just putting into people, unfortunately. That's why we've seen so many layoffs.
I think that's definitely true. The one distinction that I'll draw out here between an advisor and a fractional is your advisor is advising. I recommend this. Here are the next steps I would take. A fractional is probably actually doing that work too. They are actually drawing up the plans. They are interacting directly with vendors. They are representing the company. And so that's what I mean by embedded. Certainly advisory work is part of the work that I do. And I find that those engagements are lower in terms of hours. Maybe I'm advising a company as a subject matter expert for 4 or 6 hours a month. So, of course, they're not going to ask me to execute on anything that I suggest, but I'll be there to help point them in the right direction. A fractional is usually really truly embedded within the company. They're attending all hands meetings. They are actually producing work on behalf of the company. And so it's a nuance, but it's something that I see as a little bit of a distinction between the two in terms of roles. And again, I think it's something that's newer. It's something that's gaining traction. And again, leaning into the advisory comment that you made 100%, we need these experts. We need them in different ways. And there are a lot of folks like yourselves, like myself, that are trying to adapt to what the industry needs now to meet the moment. I think we all thought coming back into 2025 that things would really pick up. The reality is we're halfway through the year and we're still really in the same situation. So, what I encourage folks to do, it's so hard to be out of work, but look for more creative ways to build out your career portfolio and make sure that you are leaning into as much visibility as you possibly can. LinkedIn, I think, is a really powerful resource, depending on how you use it. And, the reality too is that people are finding jobs through their network. People are calling people that they know. Can you come in and fill this role? Whether it's a full-time role, a fractional advisory, etc. So you can't just apply for a job anymore. And at some point, I'm sure we'll find our industry in a different position. Industries ebb and flow. But I've never seen a trickier time. And so I applaud everyone out there that is still just grinding and moving things forward. And again, coming up with creative solutions to accomplish some of the problems that we're encountering.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for breaking that down. It is something that I am seeing a lot more on LinkedIn, people talking about like fractional. Is that something that they should consider? And we do have candidates reach out to us and asking, what do you know about like fractional? Is that something I should get myself into? We are seeing a lot more of these executives now branch off and build out their own consulting company, right? Where they do advisory, or as you said, fully be embedded in these companies. So it is something that we are seeing, gain a lot of traction. So I'm curious how that's going to shape out in the next couple of years. I mean, as you mentioned, the market is tough right now, but we've seen this before, right? We've seen this, at the beginning of the pandemic. And then after that, there was that big boom. So, we're definitely hopeful it's going to pick back up. But right now, you're right. People need to be really creative as they're navigating, their job search. It definitely is different. But out of that comes all these creative solutions, fractional. And is that something that long-term is going to gain traction?
And it's a good question. I mean, yes, I think some people are pouring a lot of energy into creating infrastructure around themselves. Like you mentioned, a consulting firm. I am definitely leaning into that. I'm looking at this as an opportunity really to build a portfolio career because the reality is we do work in a volatile industry. Those pushes and pulls you mentioned are ones we're all familiar with. We're not exactly an industry that's going to always be bulletproof. And so, I think my approach to this is to build a career that is fit for purpose and that does have more of a bulletproof layer to it, because I think there's always going to be a need to have experts that are they're seasoned drug developers in every different discipline. And I'll be curious to see how it unfolds. I think people are taking it a couple different ways. Some are leaning in more casually, taking engagements as they come up. And some people are leaning in really hard and building out consulting firms with a fair amount of infrastructure because they see this drag on and they don't know what that looks like for them. And I'm an optimistic person, and I know that this industry ebbs and flows. But I also want to build an infrastructure for myself that makes sense and also gives me opportunities, not only to display the fact that my perspective tends to be a little unique. I've worked at site, CRO, sponsor, so that 360-degree viewpoint, but also, thinking about the silos, thinking about the bottlenecks that we see, the fragmentation that we see. Are there ways that we can restructure how we think about some of the things that slow us down in drug development and therefore cost us time, cost us money, and delay getting important drugs to patients?
For sure. I think this is where I think people are going to start being very intentional with their career moves in what they're doing, because I think when you start being intentional and just not moving for a title or the money, you're building a career versus just jumping around. And I think we're probably going to start seeing that quite a lot, because like you said, you put yourself in a position right now where you're building something for yourself versus someone who's just maybe jumped around just for more money or a little title, this and that. And now it's like, okay, where do I stand? I've been everywhere, but nowhere at the same time. So it's like, where do I go from here? And yeah, I think hopefully we start seeing that a little bit more, where people can be a bit more intentional.
I love the use of the word intentional. And I think that's more important than ever now. I've always been someone who liked to have I know it sounds silly, but 5 or 10-year plan. And that looks very different now, frankly, than it did 5 or 10 years ago. And some of that is you can't necessarily predict where you'll go, but some of that is market driven, is the environment that we're in and the fact that we can't control that. So we either rise to the occasion and meet the moment, or we get left behind. And I think that intentionality is so important. And it's also stepping into a new era of what companies or what executives, what companies are looking for these days. And I think leaning into who you are as a person, as a leader, as an individual, that personal brand piece has really become important. It's more than just what work you've done, but who you are and what you stand for, what your values are, how you lead, why you chose to do what you do that makes people stand out.
No, absolutely. And on that note, what's one pivotal moment in your career that taught you something that you still apply to today?
I've had a couple of really poignant conversations with executive leaders that I really, really respect. They come from very different backgrounds, but I think what I've wanted to lean into recently in response to their feedback was getting back to the basics and how important clinical operations really is. Again, I mentioned earlier in our chat that it's often overlooked. It's seen as vendor management. It's seen as a PM. We sort of see it as, a supportive function. But in my view, the companies that do the best are ones that really lean into senior level clinical operations strategists to help them shape their clinical strategy, shape their clinical operations, and shape their company, that give clinical operations a seat at the table. And so I think what those leaders helped me realize, maybe again for myself, is that not only is that an important role, and I think we all know that it is, but advocating for that function, advocating for the visibility of that function, advocating for the visibility of those leaders, and showing those folks what their path forward can look like is something that I've become more and more passionate about. Leaning into whatever your superpowers, your personal superpowers are. And one of mine is definitely clinical operations. And I love that I've gotten to expand my scope beyond that. I love that I've had opportunities at the executive table. I love that I've gotten to present to boards of directors. Those are experiences that I really value. But the core of my expertise is clinical operations. And so making sure that I can provide a voice to that function and provide visibility to how tough that job really can be. Yeah, leaning into, some of your core strengths, I think can be a real superpower.
No, I completely, especially I think it all comes back to like maybe being in this position where this market is not doing so well, you get to understand more and more about yourself. And one of the things that every time we do a podcast, we get questions from people like, please ask these questions to leaders that you speak to. You've obviously been in clinical operations. You've built teams in clinical operations. So someone like yourself who's looking at resumes, you're looking to build a team, hire people. What are you looking for when, hiring in clinical operations?
It's so variable on what I need at that given moment. I really look at that specific role and that specific team, that specific situation. Number one, of course, you're looking for a specific skill set. But there are times, depending on what role you're hiring for and what is going on in your company, where you might have the bandwidth to bring in someone from a site or a CRO and train them. There are other times when I need someone yesterday who knows this job, can work without any infrastructure, and really has that solid ClinOps startup background. So it really depends on what you need at that moment. And I'm very much a proponent of those transferable skill sets and helping folks navigate career development through sites, CROs, sponsors. I'm very much a proponent of that. It doesn't always work. So looking for what you need at that moment. Do you need someone with specific therapy area expertise? Will that matter? Do you need someone with specific geographical expertise or phase expertise? Do you need someone who is comfortable in the ambiguity of a startup? Do you need someone who can lead teams as well as trials? That people management skill set is tough. In clinical operations, especially on the junior levels, we are taught to cross our T's and dot our I's and pay attention to every single detail. As we become leaders, it can be tough for us to learn to step back and, see the forest through the trees, really look at the bigger picture, look 3, 6, 9, 12 months out at risks that might be coming down the road. And that's a difficult skill set to learn. So there's never one thing I'm always looking for. But what I will say on that note is I'm looking for passion. I'm looking for cultural fit. Small teams particularly, each individual plays such a big role in the success of the team. And teams can get easily distracted by drama between particular team members, lack of fit between particular team members. And so that is one thing that I think is a pretty big focus for me is making sure that person fits the team, fits the culture, fits that moment. But I love seeing passion for what they do. I tend to look for folks that do hold the patient as their North Star, that are not just looking for that next title or that next salary bump, but that really want to contribute to the field and therefore grow a career. I'm certainly all for ambition, and I certainly subscribe to that myself. But, to me, going back to those early days as a coordinator, the patient will always be my North Star. And so I want people who are thoughtful about that and really want to come in and do things as best we possibly can from a compliance standpoint, from an operational standpoint, and from a patient-focused standpoint.
Yeah. I think soft skills are such an underrated thing when people are applying for jobs. It's like, you really, if you have the skills, great. That's obviously going to get you so far, but, fit in a team and fit in the culture is also important. One thing that we spoke about at the beginning of this call is we discussed clinical trials. Every morning when I read an article, there's a program that's failing and it's out the door and people are, lost their job and it's gone. Like sometimes companies just don't exist anymore. They've just disappeared into thin air. So what's one common mistake you see companies making when designing or kicking off, clinical trials?
They're rushing. So I think that one thing I like to highlight is really thinking about first principles. What do we need preclinically? What do we need from a CMC perspective? What do we need in order to truly get to the clinic? The clinic is exciting. Having a clinical stage compound is exciting. But again, I'll highlight the need to walk before you run. There are a lot of companies that are in licensing compounds from others. Was enough diligence done in order to make that decision? Have all of the boxes that need to be checked for that IND really been checked? Or are there things the agency is going to push back on? And maybe we can successfully push back on some of those things. Will they come back to bite us down the road? And again, there's this rush to get a protocol out the door, therefore get a trial initiated. But is the protocol operationally sound? My ethos is that there's a lot of value in seeking, of course, KOL expertise, medical, cross-functional expertise. But what about leaning into getting some feedback from your CRO, getting some feedback from some of the vendors that are going to have to build systems around that protocol, getting some feedback from some of your key sites that you're hoping will really be excited about that protocol? What if a coordinator looks at it or a patient advocate? Our protocol is sort of that clinical trial North Star, if you will. And if it's not operationalized well, no one's going to enroll in it. And that speed, that desire to get there as fast as we can, we often miss some of the goalposts we should be looking at and really making sure that we have the right protocol, that we have the right endpoints, that we have the right schedule of assessments, that the inclusion criteria makes sense, et cetera.
Yeah, I think everyone wants to get into the market fast. That's the number one priority. Let's get there fast before anyone else does. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. I think more often than not, it probably doesn't. And I read an article the other day that was really interesting, how CROs are moving offshore a lot. Their work is moved offshore. So this article was discussing, it's an interesting point, how is that going to affect things that are going to go into market? Are these people offshore, prepared? Are they trained enough? Like, do they know how to deal with the FDA? Or do they know that? Is that going to cause a ripple effect on like drugs just not making it into the market, as quickly or as fast as they used to? So what do you think of that in terms of like CROs moving offshore and how that's going to affect, trials and in the future?
I think it's hard to say. I think the reality is the large CROs have had offshore teams for many years. That's not new. I think there is a higher focus right now on, number one, efficiency, and number two, cost-cutting strategies. And I don't mean, of course, there are people cutting teams and restructuring, and that is happening across the CRO world as well. But CROs are looking for ways to do the same work more efficiently or at a lower cost. Now, yes, I think that those kinds of strategies can work, but it's all about creating the right infrastructure up front. You can have massive teams of programmers, for example, in a different time zone, but some of the logistical problems that I've encountered, just to be very specific, are what if they need to talk to you? What if you need to talk to them? Are you talking to them at 2 a.m. in order to kind of bridge that time zone gap? I've had groups of programmers, for example, located so far into Eastern Europe that there was only maybe 1 hour that was realistic in a day that I could speak with them. And this is related to an IXRS build, I believe. And that hour, once a day, that's actually not more efficient. That's actually going to slow us down because I have to then wait 24 hours again to be able to get those folks on the phone. So there are reasons to do it. There are efficiencies, but training is a really important piece of that. And accessibility is important too. Maybe you need a PM that's, in the right time zone and can translate things back and forth. You need to ultimately make sure that the pivots you're making still lean into compliance systems and still lean into client-friendly systems. I can tell you out here on the West Coast, even, and the 3 hours difference between someone that lives on the East Coast for folks working in different time zones, that makes a big difference to that, the ease of getting on the phone with Europe, for example.
Now we have time for one last question. So Suzanne, I want to ask you, what is one common misconception people have about clinical operations that you'd love to clear up?
Yeah, the soapbox that I'll get on here, and we've mentioned this a couple of times, but I'll get back on it, and I will always get back on it, is that clinical operations is such a critical function. They are not a PM. They are not a vendor babysitter. They are a strategic powerhouse that makes a clinical stage company successful. I think the right clinical operations teams can make or break programs. Now, it's not always operations. There are other things that happen that make programs fail. But I think not understanding how important clinical operations is and really the complexity that comes from managing a clinical trial, managing a CRO, managing a multitude of vendors, really truly managing site relationships on what can be a massive global scale, depending on the size of your trial. My closing message is not to underestimate clinical operations, to give clinical operations the seat at the table that it truly deserves, and to really lean into your clinical operations team. They know so much and they work so hard. And when things are moving smoothly, they can feel invisible. When things go off the rails, it obviously feels a lot different. So it's such a critical function. It's such a critical skill set. And it's one that I think we don't pause and celebrate frequently enough.
No, yeah. And we appreciate you, highlighting that and bringing in a lot of awareness. Those of us who, on LinkedIn who don't follow Suzanne, I recommend following Suzanne. You do a really great job of painting a picture of what it really looks like behind the scenes, and you break it down very well. So even those of us that are not in the weeds of clinical operations can really understand, the nuances of what it takes to really get, through a clinical trial.
I appreciate that. No, thank you for that. It's been a pleasure. Love for you guys to all follow along. I also think that I'd be remiss to not pause and really thank another really critical hero here, and that's the clinical research coordinator. That's where I started. And those folks, their job is so hard, balancing everything that's coming in from CROs, from sponsors across how many different trials. That job is incredibly difficult. And so, those folks are really unsung heroes as well. And so I think that's worth mentioning in this audience too. Thank your coordinators.
Absolutely. Well, huge thank you to our guest, Suzanne, for joining us today and sharing such valuable insights. Thank you so much for tuning in to Statistically Speaking, and we'll catch you next time.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thanks.